take risks. This is the opportunity, this is the time to take risks. If you sit back, someone else is going to do that. Jeff Bezos didn't set up Amazon without taking risks. You must take risks.
Welcome to the Agile Digital Transformation Podcast, where we explore different aspects of digital transformation and digital experience with your host, Tim Butera, Content and Community Manager at AgileDrop.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I'm joined today by William Makower, founder and managing director of Panlogic, a digital consultancy from the UK founded in 1999 and working frequently with the UK government. In this episode, William and I will be discussing what the private sector can learn from the public sector in the context of digital transformation. Welcome, William. Thank you for being with us today. Is there anything you would like to add to the introduction?
No, if you'd like some background as to how we started the company, we can maybe talk about that for a bit. If that would be interesting for your listeners.
Yeah, sure. If you have some interesting stories, go ahead.
Well, I met with my business partner at business school. We were both at Imperial College doing an MBA, and we decided to do something involved with the internet. This was back in 1998 when my second child had just been born during the year. And the idea was to set up originally a digital agency to build websites. But when we looked at the market, and when particularly we were looking at America, we saw that most of their real estate had been built and the real opportunity lay in digital marketing. And so that's where we began. We began sort of looking at web statistics and usage data. And our first client, very fortunately, was Honda. And so we worked with them for a long time. But then the dot-com boom happened, and then the dot-com bust happened. Mm-hmm. And we had to think very quickly how we were going to survive. And that's when we started looking at the public sector.
So you said that you're doing a lot of work in the public sector now?
Yeah, I mean, so the business is now 22 years old. Over the last 18 years, we've been working mainly across the public sector. I mean, it's not entirely. We do quite a lot of work in the charity space, and we do quite a lot of work for transnational organizations like the OECD or G20 or whatever. But most of the work is here in the UK, concentrating on the public sector, yeah.
So, okay, judging from your experience, what would you say are the crucial differences between digital transformation approaches in the public sector versus the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the government has got a massive task, starting from a legacy position. So a lot of businesses have gradually, in the commercial sector, either transfigured themselves from being analog systems into digital systems over a number of years, or indeed they've started as a digital business. The government obviously starts from a very different place. So I think that's one big difference, is it's got a lot of systems, a lot of legacy systems, and a lot of analog paper-based systems. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is that it can take risks in a way that the commercial sector is obviously a profit-driven sector, virtually always. And so whenever it's making a decision, it's an investment decision where it has to see a payoff in a certain amount of time. Obviously, government looks at it slightly differently. And yes, of course, it wants to spend public money wisely, and we might come back to that. But behavioral change is one of those really big areas for government. And it's trying to create behavioral change. And so therefore, profit motive isn't always the same thing. And that means it can take risks. It can do things which don't necessarily have the payoff that the commercial sector will require.
That's a very good point, because I think from a kind of inexperienced perspective, I think a lot of people would say that, oh yeah, of course the private sector can take more risks than the government, but that's not taking into account the profit factor, right? Which you highlighted just now.
Right, exactly, Tim. I think it's a really crucial point. I mean, I think often people look in at the public sector and think there's a lot of waste, and it's an inefficient sector. And there could be, the private sector is much more efficient. And in some cases, that is true. There's no question. There are very large IT projects, be them in health or the MOD or whatever, which are very well publicized and have cost the taxpayer a lot of money and have not worked. But I think that sometimes is the result of wanting to make significant change and change behaviors. it's not always possible. I mean, obviously they were colossal mistakes, and no one's trying to excuse them. But generally, government is looking at how it can create behavioural change, and how it can take a long-term view.
Yeah, that's another excellent point, because another misconception, about digital transformation is that it's about technology, but I think it's as much about the people as it is about the technology.
Of course, and government employs a large number of people, so there's a lot of people to bring with you over a long period of time.
Yeah, I know that the UK has actually invested quite heavily in this field. Like, do you know any best practices or really good examples of processes and in the public sector digital transformation?
Well, I mean, I think internationally one looks at, traditionally South Korea and Estonia were two countries which sort of grabbed the digital transformation agenda across government. But here in the UK, it really began, I would say it really began around about 2010. And at that stage, there was a lady called Martha Lane Fox who set up lastminute.com, and she was approached by Francis Maude, who was the cabinet secretary at that time, to look at government digital estate and government communications and consider if what we had at that stage was the right thing. At that point, we had something called Business Link, which was government communications out to businesses. And then we had DirectGov, which was the equivalent to citizens, to consumers. And each department had its own website. Each department looked utterly different. The Foreign Office looked different for the Department of Trade. That looked different to the Home Office, etc., and Treasury, whatever. And these departments were going off in different directions. There was no uniformity across all the communication, and of course, large numbers of people were employed. And Francis Maude tasked Martha Lane Fox to have a new look at how digital might expand over the next period of time. And Martha's paper sort of came back and said, this is revolution, this is not evolution. We need to make a fundamental change. We need to bring consistency to all our communication. We need to centralize this. We must stop the sprawl and the continuous growth of digital domains and websites, which was just confusing the public. We need to bring it all together. And that was the beginning of .gov. And so that was, I suppose, a sort of major change, a major initiative, which is what we have now. And undoubtedly, there was a lot of pain in the process, but it's a much better process now, and a much better provision for the country than what we had before. But so that would be an example of, a major strategic change across the public sector. Obviously, much more recently, we got the furlough scheme. The ability for companies to be able to pay their staff through the payroll and to get repaid within the week or the month or whatever it is. We haven't actually furloughed anyone, so I'm not exactly sure. But that is all managed through an online process. Of course it is. That's what we expect to be able to do. Equally, the recently announced scheme for Eat Out to Help Out, Rishi Sunak's idea that we should eat out Monday to Wednesday in August and get paid half the bill, will all be managed, obviously, through an online process. And these are applications and processes which we just wouldn't have been able to have a few years ago. So they're great examples of how government is using digital media to achieve substantial change, major change. In our own field, we're doing a lot of work across the fire and rescue services. We're doing a piece of work across local government to get homeless people off the streets. We're doing a piece of work for the NHS across those who present with multiple morbidities, cancer and maybe diabetes or something else. So these, we could talk about those pieces of work if we wanted to, but I think there's a ton of good examples across government.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a really, especially in the UK, a totally nation-scale effort and initiative to kind of streamline the whole processes, and it sounds like it definitely has been effective so far.
Yeah, I think generally, if I'm just talking to my friends or family, and we compare, how it used to be trying to get a passport, trying to sort out a health appointment or whatever it was, compared to nowadays, undoubtedly people say it's better. It is a smoother process. Some of the capabilities on .gov are better than others. I think Charity Commission is the latest one, which has been brought online through the .gov system. And when that happens, there's pain. There's pain in the for the people in the existing departments, and there's a lot of technical change. But at the end of it, it's better.
And you mentioned early on that government organizations are able to take more risks in their digital transformation efforts because they aren't constrained by profit. And can you tell us a little bit more about where and why they're able to take bigger risks, and maybe some examples of really big risks in public sector digital transformation?
Well, let me, if I may, just talk about a project that we're doing, because I can talk about it with more authority and more knowledge. Okay. So we're working with the UK Fire and Rescue Service. So the UK Fire and Rescue Service is a patchwork service. It's made up of 50 independent fire services across the country. There is no consistency across all of them. There's some consistency between them. And their operational guidance, how they operate, varies from region to region because they have different breathing apparatus, they have different ladders, they have different fire engines. So while you fight the fire in the same way, actually what you do to fight that fire may vary from region to region. And they wanted to bring consistency of how this information was picked up by and used by the fire crews on the ground. And they also wanted to make sure that as learnings came up from a fire being fought, let's say in Leicestershire, but that was applied to the fire crews or the fire service down in Devon or in Scotland. And that bottom up as well as top down approach to best practice was something which they didn't have because it was a patchwork service. It was all done at independent level, at individual region level. So we've been building a massive platform to reconsider how best practice, how guidance, how risk, etc., is considered for the fire crews and for the service operators in all the fire services. And that's an example of a project which, if you were to look at it in terms of return, well, the return is in lives. It's in security and safety. It's not a profit thing. It's got nothing to do with profit. But if we can save lives by having better practices, well, of course, that's what government is there for. It's there to protect its citizens.
Yeah, and that's an excellent selling point, and especially kind of shifts the whole conversation, the context of the conversation. Whereas on the one side, in one area, you have profit as kind of the key driving factor, and on the other side, you have stuff like basic human rights. You have stuff like health, like lives, as you just said. It yep. really kind of gives you a new perspective of how risky stuff is and how to approach it, stuff like that. And
we have, Tim, there's another example because it's very related to COVID. Yeah, I mean, obviously everyone is thinking about COVID at the moment. We were doing a piece of work and have been doing a piece of work for the Office of National Statistics. The ONS run lots of surveys. They have something called a time use survey. So this is a longitudinal survey, and they want to see how we use our time and how that has changed over the generations. Obviously nowadays, we spend a lot more time on digital media and devices than we used to, let's say, 20 years ago. Now, the way of collecting that data traditionally has been paper and pen, and you identify what you've done for every 10 minutes of your day. You cooked, or you cleaned, or you went to bed, or you looked after your granny, or you went out to the theatre, whatever you did. Every 10 minutes of your day, you note down on a bit of paper. Now, obviously, that is highly labor intensive, both for the person completing the survey, but also for the statisticians and the analysts looking at thousands of bits of paper and trying to bring it together. And they commissioned us to develop that in a digital format. That obviously makes easy sense, makes good sense. And we started working on this project in around about October, November. At one particular section of it, and as the project developed, we kept sort of improving it and listening to user needs and all the classic things you do, and started building it. And of course, then COVID hits, and lockdown hits in March, and the Office of National Statistics then started using this survey to understand how our time has changed and what we're doing at home, how much obviously we're using digital media like this to conduct interviews. because that will impact the decisions which are made by the Treasury and other spending and spending departments of where they need to put resources going forward. And so that survey, which was just looking at time use, is now looking at resource allocation and what that means for government in terms of what it needs to provide as we change our working practices across the country because of COVID.
So it was really fortunate that you started this project months before COVID hit, which meant that it was ready-made for the lockdown in the pandemic.
Exactly. And if you go on the Office of National Statistics website and you search, you'll find the results from the use of that survey tool now being used in real time. So it's been, there's an example of government thinking ahead of something it wanted to do and then reacting really quickly. And again, government can be criticized for being slow and lethargic. But here's an example of them being really reactive to the situation, saying, well, we've got something, let's use that to achieve what we need.
But that also means that you have to have a really good digital transformation partner, right? Because as Panlogic, you were able to satisfy their needs so accurately and so significantly that it was much more helpful than you ever anticipated.
I'd like to think we did a good job, but I think also, that's nice of you, Tim, but I think also, at all levels of government, you have, at all levels of society, you have people who are innovators and passionate, and you have people who are slower and more methodical. And it just depends on that mix of individuals in your client as well, whether they're also, taking risks and brave and able to make the case to their superiors that they should spend money in this area because that's important. So, you need good people all around.
That's a very good point. So we're actually back to the people now again, as we pointed out in the beginning. Do you have any other really interesting examples of projects that Panlogic has worked on in this area?
There's an interesting project we've been doing with the NHS. So this is actually being led by Guy's and St Thomas's and Macmillan Cancer Care. So as we probably all know from our personal lives, if you have a friend or a relative who gets cancer, that's a major illness and that needs treating. But if you are an octogenarian or non-octogenarian in your 80s and 90s and you develop cancer, it probably is not going to kill you. There is probably something else that's going to kill you. Maybe diabetes will kill you or heart disease will kill you. But when that patient arrives in hospital with cancer, aged 84, it's immediately assumed that cancer treatment must trump all other diseases that patient presents with. And NHS were saying, well, hold on a second, that may not be the case. We need all the experts around us. We need a diabetes expert, we need a cardiovascular expert, we need the heart disease expert. We might need someone who's a specialist with eyesight because this patient has issues with all these different areas and cancer. And then we need to consider which are the illnesses we need to treat first and which ones are most likely to produce a death or further complications. And again, that is something which is quite difficult to do with bits of paper because you have multidisciplinary units, which is what they call them in the NHS. They all go off to their different areas of the hospital. They might work in different hospitals. And digital media and databases can really help identify for that particular patient what their needs are and make sure that cancer is not always going to be the trump card and all the other morbidities are disallowed or are not considered. And so this is a piece of work we're doing where we're trying to help the doctors and the clinicians prioritize what they're presented with and work out together what is the best way to deal with this particular patient.
So it's another example of something that has a direct impact on a huge number of people's lives, just as we were talking about before.
Absolutely. And I think, government, of course, what can happen is there could be lots of these different types of projects which aren't joined up, and someone has to sort of look across the whole piece. Interestingly, in that particular project, it's co-funded by not only the NHS, by Macmillan, and Macmillan have got an overview of what's happening across cancer across the country. So they're able to know that this project is happening. It doesn't need to be replicated up in Preston or in Scotland or wherever that might be.
And maybe now we're kind of more concentrating on the positive sides of public sector digital transformation, but do you remember a particularly troublesome challenge that you encountered and had a hard time solving with Panlogic in your digital transformation projects?
Well, there's a project which was set by the Ministry of Housing and Local Government to get homeless people off the street. And this was trialled in London. And it has had a number of difficulties that we've definitely been involved with. And one of the difficulties is every London council has a housing officer, and they have independent systems. So local government is less joined up than central government generally. And each individual housing officer has their own way of procuring and identifying and making available properties to citizens in their local authority. And so when you're trying to create a national system or even just a pan-London system, you have to consider all the different ways that these different boroughs are doing it and different councils are doing it. And that is complicated. That is, that's messy, and you go down a path and then you realize that's not right, and you have to retrench or you have to rebuild something. So, and I think that's where you need really good management to say, hold on, stop. We need to reconsider this, or we hadn't thought about these legacy systems. We need to look back at this to go back to it. So, yeah, I mean, mistakes happen, obviously.
But again, it's largely up to the people involved in the projects and initiatives. As you said, good project management.
Yeah, a good project management is essential, and you can tell when a project's going off the rails, it's because project management is not being considered. And Tim, you're probably aware of Agile as a methodology. And the move, I mean, most of these web projects now are delivered under an Agile methodology. But Agile methodology is fantastic, and it does allow changes to be made mid-scope, and you aren't just sort of locked away on a waterfall project. It's the Achilles heel for Agile and government is the older procurement departments find it very difficult because they don't know what they're procuring. It's not like you're saying, I want X, how long is it going to take? I'm going to pay Y. It's, I want X, but I want to be able to change my mind as this thing goes. And therefore, I don't know what I'm going to get out at the far end. And that makes it very difficult for procurement departments.
Yeah, that does sound like it introduces a lot of additional complications to any process or project.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, now I only have a few more general questions, but before I move on to those, is there anything in this subject area that you'd like to point out that maybe I missed or that's also you think is important?
I think there was some, if people listening are thinking, we would like to start working with the public sector, maybe I can give some sort of hints and tips and some sort of suggestions. So first of all, I'd welcome that, and people can always get in contact with us and say we're interested in sort of starting this area, and the more people serving this area, the better. But the way that procurement works is through tenders. And so people need to be aware that they're going to have to write quite heavy documents, and they're going to have quite a lot of processes, which they need to be able to articulate their process, their risks, and how they manage risks. Obviously, accessibility is really important. GDPR is really important. Usability, all these sorts of areas in the private sector are also important, but they're not front and center because they're not always front and center because it's not public money which is being used. So when public money is used, the requirement to be able to satisfy the procurement officers that you have got thorough processes is really important. When we started in the public sector, we partnered. This was a very strategic point, and again, I think might be a helpful point. Is we partnered with, we had a piece of technology which we thought could be useful in the public sector. We went and found a partner who had relationships in the public sector, and it was the Museum and Library Archive. And we went to them and said, we've got this bit of technology. We don't have any relationships in the public sector. If you want a project, or we think we could bid together for a project, we'd be pleased to share our technology. You can take the credit, but all we want out of it is a case study. And so we got a case study, and that then helped us get onto a framework, and of course then it builds from that point. So partnering to get in is probably easier than trying to apply right from the beginning, because the amount of paperwork you need is enormous.
I think that's actually a very invaluable piece of advice, because it's not the most intuitive thing that you would think while trying to secure such projects. So I think that this would be very valuable to our listeners. Thank you.
Not at all. No problem. I think the other thing I would say is, I remember someone saying to me, a person much younger than me, said there are no competitors anymore. I thought it was a really interesting comment. Of course, there are competitors on the edges, but actually, fundamentally, partnering is the answer to many of the of one's issues. And you have to work out a commercial model, which works for you for partnering. But taking a long-term view is often helpful.
I definitely agree. Great piece of advice. And maybe do you have some more general pieces of advice? Like now, this is digital transformation, public sector specific. But what about kind of some piece of advice related to what we're facing now in 2020, and now that we're kind of moving into the second part of the year and maybe a second wave and the new normal in quotation marks approaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we're definitely going to be looking at is whether we need office space. We're a digital business. It's been easy for us to work from home, but equally, the conviviality and the community of coming together in an office is something we miss, like everyone. So I think we're going to be looking at whether we can have an office Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but we don't need an office 5 days a week. Maybe we can share it with someone else, and maybe we can find some hot desking arrangement in some office space for that. So that might be something we're going to do. There are going to be companies that don't survive in this space. It's going to be very difficult for them. But with every downside, there's also opportunity. And there's no question that working practices will change. And I pointed to the office space one, and so in that space, office space providers will change. They will offer something different. They'll have to adapt. And I would say the same is true for all businesses. We will need to adapt in that instance and in other ways as well. It's important to be nimble. And it's really the bigger businesses who are going to find this more difficult. The smaller businesses will be more nimble. The bigger businesses, it's a bigger oil tanker. It takes longer and it's harder for them to change. And so there's a real opportunity for small businesses to start up, to adapt from their current practices. My advice there is talk to people, network to people, talk to as many people as you can. Partly because you'll get advice from them, and some advice you'll want and some advice you won't want, but also because that becomes a network, and that network's invaluable as you're changing a business and thinking for new opportunities. I suppose the other thing I would say, is generally two other things I would say. So one is what drives decision making is very simple. It's either fear or it's greed. And if you can identify fear or greed, now in government, a lot of it's around fear. They're worried they're going to be caught not doing the right thing. The scrutiny is increasing all the time, and they need to make sure that they have really thorough, documented processes so they can point to that if something goes wrong. So that would be my first point. Think about fear and greed. What is the driver for this when you're thinking about how to help someone? And then the second thing is take risks. This is the opportunity. This is the time to take risks. If you sit back, someone else is going to do that. Jeff Bezos didn't set up Amazon without taking risks. You must take risks. Obviously, they've got to be considered. Opportunity favors the bold. Go out, have a go, go and talk to people. It will take time to find someone on the other side who's also willing to take a risk. But if you're passionate enough in believing what you're doing, you'll break through.
Yeah, because whatever you do right now poses a certain amount of risk. So why not just go all the way and take advantage of the opportunity, as you said, and take the risk that you need to take and that you need to take to drive change for your company or your organization?
Right. Richard Branson always said, take as many risks as you want, just protect the downside. Just make sure you can only fall so far and you can't fall any further, but protect that, but then take as many risks as you can.
Yeah. That's a great note to finish on. But just before we do, if people want to reach out to you to learn more about you, what would be the best place or way for them to do that?
Well, I've got a difficult surname, which is Makower, so my email address isn't immediately easy. It's william.makower@panlogic.co.uk, but if you don't catch that, there's info@panlogic.co.uk will reach us. I'm happy to be in touch and help anyone. Okay,
great. Thank you, William, for taking the time to have this great talk with me. And to our listeners, that's all for this episode. Have a great day, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to check out our other episodes, you can find all of them at agiledrop.com/podcast, as well as on all the most popular podcasting platforms. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes, and don't forget to share the podcast with your friends and colleagues.